Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We're live.
Okay. Good evening, members of the task force, guests, folks who are joining us to listen to the presentation this evening, as well as those who may be offering us some public comment in the during the latter part of the meeting. Before we introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Corcoran, who I'd like to thank for joining us, but more to say about that in a minute. Lena, if you would call the roll of the task force, please, the members.
Thank you very much, Mr. Contompasis. Mr. Acevedo, Ms. Aguirre, Mr. Kreger,
Present.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom, Ms. Grassa,
Present.
Ms. Lum,
Present.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Present.
Ms. Garrett,
Present.
Ms. Tang,
Present.
Ms. Waite,
Present.
Ms. Sullivan,
Present.
and Mr. Contompasis.
Present, and I see that Mr. Acevedo has joined us.
Perfect, thank you.
You're on mute.
My apologies, present. Everyone.
Okay, welcome. May I, before we offer our presenter, you all have received the minutes. Hopefully you have all reviewed the minutes. I would like to entertain a motion to accept the minutes, please.
Move to accept the minutes.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Second. Any additions, deletions, comments? All in favor of accepting the meeting, signify by saying aye or raising their hand. All opposed? The ayes have it. Minutes are accepted unanimously.
Mr. Contompasis,
Yes, ma'am.
please remember, because of open meeting law, we need to call a roll for the minutes too.
Oh, that's right. Thank you for reminding me. Would you call the roll, please?
Yes, of course. Mr. Acevedo,
Yes. Accept.
Ms. Aguirre, Mr. Kreger,
Aye.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom,
I don't know if I'm saying aye or present, but I'm here.
Ms. Grassa,
Yes.
Ms. Lam,
Aye.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Yes.
Ms. Garrett,
Aye.
Ms. Tang,
Aye.
Ms. Waite,
Aye.
Ms. Sullivan,
Aye.
Mr. Contompasis.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Contompasis, also, we want to introduce our interpreters.
We can do that now, or we can do it just prior to the public comment section.
If
Which
we
do you
could-
prefer?
If we could do it now, that would be great. If you're ready,
I'm
fantastic.
ready.
Okay, here you go.
Okay. We are pleased to be offering live simultaneous interpretation this evening in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean, Portuguese, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Somali, Arabic, and American Sign Language. After I finish introducing the interpreters, we will activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. And when we are ready at public comment, please click the icon to select your language preference. Our Cantonese interpreter is Anna Say. Will you please give Zoom instructions in Cantonese, please?
Absolutely, thank you.
大家好，午安，我係 Anna，我係你今日廣東話嘅同步翻譯。如果你想聽到廣東話同步翻譯嘅咧，咁你就去熒光屏後面有個地球，有個地球儀，你就撳佢個地球儀。今日咧就要揀 Chinese，就係廣東話同步翻譯嘅啦。如果你係用手機嘅話咧，咁有3個點，咁啊點點點，咁你撳落去就會揀 Chinese 就揀就係廣東話同步翻譯。多謝大家，一陣間見。我 Thank you so much。
Thank you. Our Vietnamese interpreter is V. Phong Lee. Ms. Lee?
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Good evening. Hi, my name is V. I will be your Vietnamese interpreter for today. Kính chào quý vị. Tôi tên là Vi. Tôi sẽ là thông dịch viên của quý vị ngày hôm nay. Xin quý vị bấm vào quả cầu ở dưới đây và tìm tiếng Việt để có thể nghe được thông dịch viên nói chuyện. Cảm ơn rất nhiều. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Mandarin interpreter is Terry Yin. Please give the Zoom instructions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, my name is Terry Ying. I'll be your Mandarin interpreter. 大家好，我的名字叫 Terry， 我会是你的中文的翻译、国语的翻译。待会呢，你们在屏幕下方会看到一个地球仪的图标，你点一下地球仪，然后选择 Mandarin， 也就是国语哈，就可以听到国语的翻译了。如果你是用 iPad 或者是用手机上的话呢，你可以选择3个点，然后选择更多，然后你就可以选择这个语言的选项，同样也是可以选择到这个 Mandarin 的这个频道的。好，谢谢大家 ，Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Our Spanish interpreter is Miguel Perez.
Evening, Miguel Perez, and Spanish interpreter. Buenos días, mi nombre es Miguel Pérez, voy a ser el intérprete en español para ustedes. Antes de empezar la reunión, va a aparecer un botón a la parte abajo de la pantalla de ustedes y puedes clicar en la parte que dice español y cuando lo cliques eso te trae el canal español. Así puedes escuchar el audio en español, lo que se está traduciendo de la reunión. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Haitian Creole interpreter is Sergio Saint Hilaire.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sergio Saint-Hilaire, Haitian Creole interpreter. Et c'est un plaisir pour moi prendre parole aujourd'hui, pour moi parler, pour m'expliquer nous tout ça que vous dit dans la réunion ça. Et que maintenant, French Channel Aware, c'est là où je moi. Et que si vous besoin entrer dans la conversation, ou à cliquer dans Globe Aware, ou à entrer sans problème. Et c'est un plaisir pour moi interpréter pour aujourd'hui. Et puis, toute question gain, pas hésiter pour poser. Et que moi souhaite bonne chance. Merci.
Thank you, sir. Our Cape Verdean interpreter is Lidiana Mendez.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Lidiana Mendes, and I will be your Cape Verdean Creole interpreter. Alô, sim, boa tarde. Meu nome é Lidiana, eu sou o intérprete de Cabo Verde Crioulo. Para o acesso a serviços de interpretação simultânea, procura a ícone de interpretação no globo na parte de baixo e também para selecionar o idioma de sua preferência, que é Cabo Verde Crioulo. Obrigada. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Our Portuguese interpreter is Ana Paula de Sá.
Hi, my name is Anna. I'll be your Portuguese interpreter today. Boa noite, meu nome é Ana Paula, eu vou ser sua intérprete de português para hoje. Para acessar o serviço de interpretação simultânea, procure o ícone de interpretação logo abaixo, o globo, que está na parte inferior da tela, e selecione o idioma da sua preferência, que é português. Muito obrigada.
Thank you. Our Somali interpreter is Fatima Hassan.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Somali interpreter for the evening for you guys. Assalamu alaikum. Ama galab wanaagsan waxaan idin sheegayaa galabtay qofkii u baahan in loo turjumo luqadiisa Soomaaliga ah waxaa diyaar u ah qof u turjumaya inta uu socdo kulanka ama wada hadalka ay wadaan qof baa ku turjumaya oo aniga ah waxaa taabanaysaa meesha hoose oo qaaradda ku sawiran qaaradda markaa riixdo waxaa kaaga soo baxaya luqadda Soomaaliga meeshaas ayaa riixaysaa kadibna waxaad helaysaa qofkii ku turjumayay. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Arabic interpreter is Michael Elias.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Elias. I'll be the Arabic interpreters. مساء الخير جميعا. اسمي مايكل إلايس وسوف أكون مترجم العربي. للوصول إلى الترجمة الفورية يرجى النقر فوق زر الترجمة في الجزء السفلي من التطبيق زوم، والذي يحمل رمز الكرة الأرضية. في حال عدم رؤيتك لعلامة الكرة الأرضية فقد تضطر إلى النقر فوق رمز النقاط الثلاث لرؤية خيارات إضافية، ويمكنك النقر فوق اللغة التي ترغب في سماعها، وسينقلك ذلك إلى مترجم يتحدث تلك اللغة. شكرا. Thank you. I'm all set.
Thank you, sir. We also have ASL interpreters, Erin Foley and Sharon Mendez. Thank you. We'll now move on to our presenter for the evening. And we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Sean P. Corcoran, an associate professor of public policy and education at the Peabody College.
Corcoran s'est présenté là.
Are we okay?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Mr. Contompasas, could you repeat the introduction?
Let me start all over again. I apologize for the interruption. I don't know what it was, but all right. Dr. Corcoran is an associate professor of public policy and education at Peabody College, Vanderbilt University. He is a research affiliate of the Research Alliance for New York City Schools and the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. He was the author of a study of specialized high school admissions in New York City called Pathways to an Elite Education, Application, Admission, and Matriculation to New York City's Specialized High Schools. He's here this evening primarily to kick off, I hope, a presentation from a number of different folks who have studied, looked into various admissions policies that districts similar to Boston have adopted. This one this evening will deal with Dr. Corcoran's review study of the Chicago public school admissions plans to its specialty schools. Before I ask Dr. Corcoran to present, I'd like to thank publicly Matt Krager for making the contact with Dr. Corcoran and ask Matt if he has anything else he wants to add about Dr. Corcoran. Matt?
Simply to say thank you to Dr. Corcoran and to note how good the hands we're in are. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Great. With that, Dr. Corcoran, unless Tanisha, Ms. Sullivan, you have anything? Great. Dr. Corcoran, go to it, please.
All right. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Matt, for the invitation to join me this evening. So I was born and raised in Kansas, but Boston has always had a special place for me. My dad's side of the family is from Dorchester. They moved later in life to Hingham before it was a posh place to live. And so I spent every summer on the South Shore and spent many hours back and forth on the T to Boston. So I'm really happy to be with you today. Let me see if I can share my screen. There you go. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, so these slides are a variation on some that I gave a few weeks ago. The Century Foundation organized a sort of summit for students in selective schools across the country who are beginning to rethink how they admit students into their elite public schools. And so this presentation is really a sort of a general overview of my thoughts on selective school admissions and the various options for diversity and the pros and cons of each approach. I will say a little bit more about Chicago, although I'm not an expert in the Chicago system. I know quite a bit more about the New York system than any other place in the country, but I'll talk about each of those. But I'd like to start out these slides by asking the question, just why do we have selected public schools to begin with? It's not obvious that we should have selected public schools at all, and many cities have rethought this fundamental question to begin with. But really what academically selective schools are for is for tracking students, where you can think of the tracking as being between schools rather than within them. And so traditionally, many schools and school districts have had gifted and talented courses, programs within schools. Selective admission schools are a form of tracking between schools. Let me start my stopwatch too, so make sure I don't go on for too long. There's obviously benefits to this form of tracking. You're grouping academically advanced students. It permits specialization, provides a challenging, narrowly targeted curriculum, as well as courses that might not be possible in an open enrollment school with a more academically diverse population. And of course, some selective admission schools also select on interest. And so they're not only selecting on academic criteria, but also an interest in, say, STEM or the arts. Other commonly heard rationale for selected public schools. One is that they're a reward for past merit. I know a lot of parents think of it this way, is that my child has worked hard and so therefore they deserve this reward for admission to selective schools. I'm personally of the mind that that's not a great argument for selective schools in and of itself, given that these are public schools and we're not necessarily doling out necessarily rewards for past merits, but providing opportunities more broadly. But another stronger rationale, I would say, is that selective public schools are a way to promote upward mobility for less advantaged academically talented students. So these are very high achieving students who might not otherwise have opportunities to enroll in a selective private school, for example. And so selective public schools provide that opportunity. From the district's perspective, selective public schools are often thought of as a means to attract and retain upper middle class families. So higher income families that have options to move to other districts if they don't like their public school options are often drawn to more selective programs. And so, it's a fact of life that districts recognize that elite schools, selective schools can be attractive to middle and upper middle class families. And then of course there's tradition. So Boston Latin is a school that, as you know, goes back many hundreds of years. And so these schools carry on a really important tradition from many years ago. So that brings us to the question of who selected schools should admit. So I'm working from the assumption that selected public schools are a desirable goal for public school districts. And so now we're trying to think about what's the optimal way to admit students. So this is identifying criteria to be used and also thinking about how spaces are allocated when there are more qualified students than seats. New York City is a great example where you have 80,000 students applying each year for high school. There are only 8 exam schools, a limited number of seats. There's many, many high achieving students. How do you allocate those scarce resources when there's so many qualified students? So I organize these criteria into some general principles. These are not the only guiding principles. You may have others that I should add to this list, but these are the ones that I think about when I think about admissions to selected programs. So first and foremost is academic fit. Certainly students' goals, their interests should align with the school if they're going to be successful there. If it's a STEM school, if it's an arts magnet, obviously students' interests and life goals should align with those of the school. But the applicants should also be adequately prepared for the school. So many selective schools, including those that you're considering in Boston, have a very rigorous curriculum. And the last thing you want to do is to admit a student who's going to end up performing worse at that school than they might at their next best option. Another principle, this one is not one that's explored that much by schools and districts that are contemplating admissions criteria, but I would call this return on investment. And so this is recognizing that some students actually benefit more from selective admission schools than others. And so there's a lot of research, both at the higher education level and in secondary schools, that finds that less advantaged students, racial and ethnic minority students as well, see greater benefits from attending more selective schools than the majority group or more advantaged students. And so take two students with equal qualifications, one of those students may actually, on average, be expected to see a greater return from attending that school. Diversity and representation. So this is why a lot of schools are rethinking their admissions criteria. They found that a strict focus on academic fit has come at the cost of diversity and representation. So I put this on the list as one of the general principles for admissions, in that admitted students should reflect the diversity of the community served by the school, however that community defines diversity. And then another principle is transparency. So there are a million ways to re-engineer admissions to selective schools, but you also want parents to be able to understand that admissions process. And so while a whiz-bang admissions tool with all the bells and whistles may provide some positive outcomes, if parents don't trust or understand the system, then there's a downside as well to that. And so objectivity is important, and transparency. A couple of other comments about diversity as an educational goal. So I include diversity on this list of general principles for selective admissions because I think diversity should be an explicit goal of public schools in general. So facilitating interactions between students of diverse backgrounds, whether that's racial and ethnic, linguistic, socioeconomic backgrounds, is one of the goals of public education. And selective schools are not exempt from that fundamental goal. There's a large research backing that finds that learning with diverse populations has both individual returns as well as social and civic returns as well. And going back to Brown versus Board of Education, there's been a general sentiment in the United States that racially isolated schools on their face are not providing an equal education. So these are just some of my rationale for including diversity as a goal. But once you put representation on the table, you run into the reality that in many school districts, the distribution of achievement measures that are commonly used in admissions, like exam scores, are not distributed the same across all groups, whether that's socioeconomic background or race, ethnicity, immigration status, language, home language, gender. And these two pictures that you're seeing on the slide here are taken from New York City. So the specialized high schools in New York admit students entirely on the basis of one test. And these are the distributions of these test scores for select groups. So what you see on the left is that the distribution of test scores for white students and students from Asian background are generally above those of students who are identify as Black or Hispanic. Obviously, there's high achieving students in all of these groups, but these distributions don't look identical. And so any system that pulls from the very top of the distribution, like the system in New York, is going to have a very racially imbalanced population of students. I think lesser well known in New York and elsewhere is that there's a gender gap as well. So at least in New York City, the distribution of test scores for boys sits above that, slightly above that for girls. And so again, a highly selective admissions process is going to, in this case, pull in more boys than girls. And so there's obviously going to be a trade-off here. Any one metric like a test score like this is going to end up with a lopsided distribution of students. So this is where schools' admissions criteria come in. And so I think of admissions criteria as operationalizing those principles of academic fit, of seeking a high return on your investment, diversity, representation, and transparency. So this is asking the questions, what measures will be used to determine whether a student is a good academic fit or is adequately prepared for the curriculum in the school and is likely to succeed? How will ties be broken if there are more qualified applicants than seats? How will diversity be achieved? There's an infinite number of ways in which one could tackle that problem. And what trade-offs is the school willing to make on some of these more traditional measures of achievement that people have historically looked to in order to meet its diversity goals. And so here are some examples, and you've seen many of these before. And I'm not making a case for any of these in particular. This is just sort of what I see as the sort of universe of metrics that selective schools have used to assess academic fit and preparedness for their curriculum. So you have the admissions tests, like in New York City, like the one that's been used in Boston historically. You have the separate state test in English language, arts, and math. You have GPAs, you have class rank. Then you have the more subjective, more holistic evaluations, whether that's a portfolio of prior work, an audition, or some type of artistic product in the case of an art school, an essay. Some schools in New York historically have used interviews as well. I could include that on the list. More non-academic measures criteria that I've seen include attendance, prior behavior, maybe participation in extracurricular activities or certain service activities, and what you might call demonstrated interest, which is schools that have acknowledged that the student has participated in a school open house or something of that sort. It's a whole other conversation about how you might combine these in a way to calculate a composite score. Obviously, you're choosing weights based on what your goals are, or sort of how the distribution of those criteria look in your particular district. I can tell you in New York, a lot of schools really care about attendance, but and COVID aside, obviously in current conditions, attendance has been taken off the table. But historically, a lot of schools put weight on attendance because they see that as a strong signal of students' commitment to school. A downside to that is that it doesn't vary very much among high achieving students. And I'll mention this later, but it's also potentially disadvantaging to some students depending on their family circumstances. So I call these criteria because these are things that schools typically use to assess fit. And then you have priorities, which are criteria that are used either to break ties if you have two sort of equally qualified students, or maybe ways that you could promote other admissions goals, including diversity. So there's simple admissions priorities like a random lottery. There's geographic priorities where students from, say, a neighborhood get strict priority over those outside of the neighborhood. Then you have your socioeconomic indicators, indicators of family background. These might be family income or eligibility for free and reduced price meals programs, parental education, students living in temporary housing. A number of districts, including Chicago, and as I understand, Boston as well, have looked to neighborhood proxies for socioeconomic conditions. So maybe looking at zip code of residence or census block or tract, something of that nature. Another one that I don't see quite as often is the level of poverty at the school at which the student attends. So you could look to the student's elementary school, you could look to the middle school, and if they're attending a high poverty school, that's an indication of their own family background as well as the conditions in which they went to their prior school. So how do these get operationalized? They could be in some cases strict priorities where one group always gets admitted before group two, group one always gets admitted before group two. You see that like in the case of geographic priorities or siblings in the case of non-selective schools. But I've also seen set aside seats as well, which is, a certain group of seats are allocated to the highest performing students within a given tier of these socioeconomic indicators. A third, and I would point you to these authors who you may have had visit before, or if you haven't, you should in the future. Glenn Ellison and Parag Pathak at MIT, they have a recent paper on Chicago that looks at allocating bonus points to your composite score based on certain background measures. I think there's pros and cons to each one of these approaches. And the last thing I'll say on this slide is that these priorities serve multiple purposes. So it's a effective way to promote diversity, but they also identify students who are perhaps more likely to benefit from admission to a selective school. And they also recognize that students are bringing to the table measures of academic performance from very unequal circumstances. And so they could essentially weight scores differently depending on prior exposure. In New York, many know the specialized high schools, especially the big three, Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, and Bronx Science. But lesser known, I think, is that 27% of other New York City high schools use academic screens of some kind. That number goes up to 31% if you also include auditions, and 84% if you include the so-called educational option programs, which are 50% screened and 50% lottery. A similar percentage of middle schools use screens as well. What's remarkable is that every school in New York that is screened sets its own criteria and priorities. So if you think about those two slides I just went through, every school, every screened high school in New York is sitting down and thinking about how to weight those criteria and set priorities. And there's 420 high schools in New York. So it creates a really complicated landscape for parents trying to figure out admissions. This is pre-COVID. There's been some changes with COVID, some standardizing screens at the high school level, and we can talk about that more if that would help. So how do these criteria relate to diversity goals? I want to emphasize that these things are always context dependent. So, how things play out in New York City may not play out the same way in Boston or Chicago. It really depends a lot on the distribution of those admissions criteria, test scores, grades, et cetera, as well as the amount of neighborhood and school segregation or gentrification that exists in the school district. And so I just want to briefly mention a couple of examples from research from New York and Boston and Chicago. In New York, there's 8 exam schools. The paper I mentioned back here is my study on admissions to those 8 exam schools. It's very, very well known. This is one of the very frequent topics in the New York Times and beyond, that there's a very non-representative student population at these 8 specialized high schools. For example, 56% of offers went to Asian students and 31% of offers went to white students. Only 3% went to Black students, which is very different than the makeup of 8th grade applicants in the same year. Only 42% of offers went to girls, incidentally. Now, the specialized high school exam has this nice feature of being transparent. Like, it's one test, you know what you have to do to get into these schools. It's objective in the sense that it doesn't rely on subjective evaluations, but it's obviously not the only measure of academic fit, nor necessarily the best one. So I won't go through a lot of the details, but I'll point you to this paper that we did on New York City that simulates some different admissions criteria. So we said, what if we took the same pool of applicants and admitted them based only on their state tests? Or maybe we combined their state test with grades and maybe attendance. And then lastly, we said, what if we take those same criteria and then admit students proportionally by borough of the city, or maybe admit the top 10% of students from every middle school? How would this affect the composition and qualifications of students in the specialized schools? So I won't go through this whole table. What I'll do is just kind of point you to the middle of this table, which basically shows you the baseline racial and ethnic composition of offers to the specialized high schools. And then as you move to the right, how that would change under different admissions rules. And typically what we find is that moving away from the single exam dramatically increases the proportion of girls admitted, and it has modest effects on the proportion of Latinx students admitted. It has very small effects on the proportion of Black students admitted, and actually leads to an increase in proportion of white students admitted and a reduction in the proportion of Asian students admitted. The only like sort of dramatic changes that you see in racial and ethnic composition are the last two columns, which is proportional representation by borough, by which I mean taking the highest performing students by these measures in each of the 5 boroughs of New York City, or doing a top 10% measure at the middle school level. If you look at the top of this table, you see kind of the effects on the academic qualifications of students admitted. So you see some modest changes in grades, modest changes in the state test scores of admitted students, with the biggest reduction in the average math scores of admitted students in the top 10% plan. Now, we wrote this paper, going on six years ago. So if I were writing this now, I might throw in some alternatives to these, but these are the ones we explored at the time. I'm not going to talk about Boston because I'm assuming that you know this well, and you know the paper by Rusinski and Josh Goodman. I will note the difference that they found between Boston and New York is that there's actually bigger gaps in test taking in Boston than in New York. So we didn't find that racial ethnic differences in taking the exam were that different, were that stark as they found in Boston. Similarity to our findings is that the simulations that increased diversity the most were either automatic admission based on state tests or admitting some top % of students by middle school. And then my last example, I know I've run on a little bit long, is Chicago. So there's 11 selective high schools in Chicago. For many, many years, Chicago used a race-conscious admission system to ensure racial diversity. So from 1980 to 2009. Supreme Court basically blocked the option for districts to use race-conscious admission systems. And so in 2010, they moved to a race-neutral system targeting socioeconomic integration. And what happens there is applicants take an admissions test and they rank up to 6 of these schools. They're assigned a composite score, which is based on their exam score, their 7th grade score on state tests, and their 7th grade GPA. And Chicago has chosen to weight these equally, but of course they could have done that differently. Chicago's gotten a lot of attention because they split up their available seats into 5 equally sized bins. The first bin is what they call merit seats. And the merit seats are simply reserved for the top scoring students. So they pick off, based on that composite score, the top 20% of students, and they're admitted into this merit seats bin. The rest of the seats are divided equally among the 4 tiers of socioeconomic status based on census tracts. So tier 1 is the lowest SES census tracts in Chicago, and 4 is the highest. These tiers are defined based on equal number of Chicago public school students. And here are some of the criteria they use. They use median family income, the % of single parent households, the % of households where English is not the first language, % owner occupied homes, and adult educational attainment. Oh, as well as average state test scores for the schools in the attendance area. I'm not sure how they came up with this particular set of census tract criteria, but these are the ones that they use. And here's a map of Chicago showing those 4 socioeconomic tiers, where the lighter blue is the less advantaged tracts and darker blue is more advantaged. What you see is that the selective enrollment schools in Chicago are not, they don't match the racial ethnic composition of the Chicago public schools as a whole. But I would say compared to other selective schools that I've seen in New York and around the country, they're doing fairly well. So if you look at all selective enrollment schools, 33% of students admitted are Latinx, 10%, 27.5% are Black, 10% Asian, and 25% white. So Black and Latinx students are still underrepresented, but they're well represented at these selective enrollment schools. You also see that in terms of bilingual students or students with disabilities or receiving free and reduced price meals, not as well represented in the specialized high schools, although close to half of students in these schools are eligible for free reduced price meals. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not an expert in Chicago. I just know what I am reading from the research, and I follow the city's case study closely. This recent paper by Ellison and Pathak that I mentioned is an important one. It's a kind of a technical paper, but it lays out a great framework for thinking about this kind of trade-off between diversity and academic merit. And the key lesson I think there is that these tiers in Chicago are an imperfect proxy for student background. So they're not using students' actual background, they're using their neighborhood. And obviously you can't do as well with neighborhood because it's an approximation. And they find that the Chicago public schools could further increase diversity without sacrificing selectivity, or they could increase selectivity without reducing diversity, meaning that they could do better, on both criteria, at least one of the two criteria, with some modest adjustments to their system. One other lesson, there's another recent study that people have been pointing to from Chicago that finds that exam schools generally don't increase test scores in Chicago, and they actually find a negative impact for students from low SES neighborhoods, and specifically on grades and the probability of attending a selective college. A number of readers, including myself, have looked at that result with concern as we try to diversify representation at more selective schools. But an interesting sort of appendix to that finding is that in Chicago, students who are high achieving, who might otherwise go to exam schools, are very likely to go one of these noble chain charter schools, which in Chicago are found to be very effective. And so this is a great example of where context is really important. It really matters sort of what the next best alternative is. So your high achieving students in low SES neighborhoods, if they're not going to a selective school, where would they be going in the absence of that? So I'll just close by kind of connecting each of these criteria to diversity goals. The academic criteria of admissions tests, state test scores, grades, and holistic evaluations, I would say are in sort of descending order or increasing or ascending order of opportunities to improve diversity. Admissions tests by themselves in almost every setting have found very large racial and socioeconomic differences. Another thing worth thinking about is the sort of ability to invest in test preparation for single admissions tests. That's one of the biggest criticisms in New York of the Shazat test. Attendance, as I mentioned earlier, is something that schools seem to say is really important, but you can't really rank students based on attendance because among high achieving students, attendance is generally very good. And putting too much weight on attendance may actually privilege families with more resources. It also relies on accurate reporting of attendance as well from schools. Lotteries, people are scared of lotteries because they introduce a random element to it. And certainly a selective school can't be an entirely lottery-based school, otherwise it's no longer selective. But it can be used in combination with minimum thresholds for academic fit. So if the school can think about the criteria that would seem to signal success at the school, sort of setting a lower threshold for admission and offering random admissions for students above that threshold it has potential to promote diversity. But of course, it depends on where you set that bar. And then lastly, geographic priorities can promote diversity to the extent that they increase enrollment of underrepresented students. But there are examples of where they do the opposite. So District 2, historically, the Upper East Side in New York City has given priority to its neighborhood students, and that's a generally higher income neighborhood, and has closed out a lot of less advantaged students from the selective schools in that neighborhood. In terms of socioeconomic indicators, So priorities and set aside seats for applicants from underrepresented backgrounds can be very effective in promoting diversity. You're often limited to the data that you have. Sometimes you'd like to have information about parents' education. That's a good indicator, but that's often not available at the individual level. Income is not collected very well these days at the school level with the Universal Free Meals Program, and so there's some challenges there. Set aside seats for applicants from underrepresented neighborhoods can be very effective and can be useful when individual data is unreliable or incomplete. But as I mentioned from that Chicago paper, these neighborhoods can be imperfect proxies for individual circumstances, and it kind of depends on the degree of segregation and gentrification that you observe in your own city. And I don't see that many systems that use priorities for the schools that kids attended in the past, but I think this could deserve more attention. And I'll leave it there. And here's the links to the many studies that I mentioned throughout the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Corcoran. Thank you very much. So we're gonna open this up to task force members who may have questions, clarifying or otherwise, for Dr. Corcoran or for us as a group to consider. Are there any? Yes, Ms. Garrett.
Thank you, Dr. Corcoran, for that really informative presentation. Very much appreciated. I noticed on one of your later slides where you talked about various approaches and the holistic method was mentioned. You talked about the advantage of a more holistic method, but also the disadvantage that families with privilege could influence that process more subjectively. I was also curious whether what your research was on kind of size thresholds for realistic admissions pools using something that is subjective. Our current system is computerized, probably for similar reasons to New York's, dealing with issues of size and not having full-time folks devoted to a selection process. I used to work in DC public schools and we had selective admission schools, but the admissions was school-based. Are there large districts that are doing subjective admissions at a district level with thousands of applicants? Are there even models?
I can't think of any. And all the examples of a more holistic of admissions that I can think of are all school-based. And it's something I've been talking a lot with the folks at Hunter College High School in New York City, and they have a two-tiered system where it's the first stage is a test, and then students above a certain threshold on the test are invited to submit the essays or materials that are more subjective in nature, and it brings it down to a more manageable level. But yeah, you know, in New York City, there's something like 40,000 students that take the specialized high school test each year, and you just can't evaluate that many portfolios.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up on that, Ms. Garrett, or are you all set?
No, thank you. That answers it. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Acevedo?
First of all, Mr. Corcoran, a comment. You may have a book on your hands. keep these notes. They would be, I wish you had already written it. I wish I had already read it. But this is definitely a presentation that we'll need to review again soon. My question actually has to do with what was the community process prior, if you're able to speak of it at all, in Chicago, prior to the institution of their admissions reforms?
That's a great question that I don't have an answer to. On the last page there's a report from the Century Foundation that provides a little bit of a history. I think that would be a good place to look. I don't want to say what the level of community input was into that process because I'm not sure.
If I could just briefly interject, we are reaching out to the Century Foundation so that we can continue looking at these schools one by one or model by model. But we're so grateful for Dr. Corcoran for the overview that lets us hit some of these at the same time.
I know Rick Kallenberg was involved in that process, and so if you get him, he'll give you the whole story.
Great. Thank you very much. Ms. Tung?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Corcoran. It was a very concise overview of a vast literature. I have two questions. One is, we know that all tests aren't the same. We know that in some districts, families have to pay and sign up and get the kid to the test. And in other districts, the tests are given, in the schools, and they're based on a curriculum that teachers teach. So I'm just curious, are there certain types of tests that, if are used for selective admissions, result in, meeting your diversity criteria? That's one question. So are some tests better, some kinds of tests better than others? And then my other question is around, do you know of any examples of districts that are doing selective high schools without a test? And if so, what were the criteria and the resulting representativeness?
These are great questions. Yeah, I mean, I on the question of sort of which kinds of tests are better for accomplishing diversity goals, I can't say that I've seen research that has done sort of head-to-head tests, comparisons of the two. I mean, other than, my work did simulations that looked at switching to the state test as opposed to the test that students have to sign up and take on a weekend historically. I know the Boston study looked at, a system in which kids were basically just assessed based on their Massachusetts state test. Those tend to do a little bit better than a voluntary test, that's produced by another outfit. But you're still going to see, I think, pretty minimal changes from just switching a test. But I do like the idea of sort of taking the voluntary participation out of the equation. Like, why introduce that barrier for students, a knowledge barrier or transportation barrier, when students are already taking a statewide assessment? Oh, and then the other question was about, are there other selective schools that use non-test based measures? I'm sure there are, and none of the prominent ones that I can think of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Grassa?
Thank you, Dr. Corcoran. I have a question about some of the alternative ways to assess for students when you mentioned like portfolios or interviews. Do you have any suggestions around how to monitor for bias and how to make sure that there are systems set up that are not disadvantaging students or advantaging other students if we, chose an alternative route?
Yeah, that's extremely hard to do, and I'm definitely not an expert on that form of assessment. I know in New York, I mean, there are many schools that use these, but it's such a decentralized system that you can never see the underlying data that went into admissions decisions. And so schools will submit their ranked applicants to the district, but not the points that were allocated to different things. So there's really no research base on which to make a judgment about whether those systems are working well or not, or are biased in any way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lum?
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Corcoran. Is there merit in leveraging the results or the research in this case to also look at what is going into the pipeline for admissions? These measurements are looking at a population of kids that are at the point of entry, whereas many of the comments from the public, as well as discussions by the previous iteration of this task force and the working group, talked a lot about pipeline and preparation of kids for even entry into admissions. And I'm wondering if you speak to that.
Yeah, I would say that's always an important piece of the puzzle. So I would never take that off the table, and that should, we should be investing in students to ensure that there aren't these gaps at the time of application. I lost my train of thought there for a second. I mean, one of the things that I would point to, I don't know how much of an issue this is in New York, but in Boston, but in New York, there's a lot of sorting of students from day one. There are, gifted and talented programs where kids are screened at age 4. There's academic screening in middle school, and some of the work that I did for my paper on the pipeline to specialized high schools found that where you go to school can have a modest effect on your performance on the test. So there may be some middle schools that are more equipped to get kids up to speed on selective high school admissions, for example. And so that's a policy that one can think about that I think can have some effects on the margin, sort of ensuring that opportunities are available to all students from an early age.
Thank you. Mr. Kondopassis.
Dr. Corcoran, I echo what everybody else in the task force has said, and thanking you for being here. This may be a little bit out of your area, but in looking at Chicago, for example, that system has been in place for a number of years now, and my assumption is that it has been tweaked periodically to, particularly around identifying qualifications for the tiers. But the question that I have is there anything written around the outcome of the process that Chicago has been using? In other words, are they satisfied with it? Obviously, they haven't been, to the best of my knowledge, challenged in court, but has it really resulted in a satisfactory approach to moving away from just simply an examination?
That's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for it since I'm not as plugged into Chicago as I am elsewhere. But I don't believe that there's been any changes to the tier assignment formula over time. So they seem to be satisfied with how how neighborhoods are categorized in that way. And I haven't heard any of the same kind of angling for changes in Chicago that I've heard in other places, which signals some satisfaction with it. There's also with any if it's an imperfect system, that frequent changes just confuse people, and so I think they are probably very cautious to make any sweeping changes on what they've been doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Nagasawa?
This might also, like Mr. Contemposs's question, be a little out of your expertise, but I think you said earlier that Chicago could increase diversity without reducing selectivity in their schools by making some minor tweaks in their system. Do you know what those tweaks are or could be?
Yes. So they identified a couple of things. One is that they did identify some changes to the tier, the components that went into tiers. There wasn't anything particularly noteworthy. I think you'd have to look at the study. There wasn't one thing that sort of stood out, but it was sort of weighting things a little bit differently, and assigning tiers would make some difference. But the biggest, I believe the biggest change that they recommended was a shift to using individual student background information to the extent possible. Because you sort of always will do better by, giving priority to a student that falls into a certain category versus lives in a neighborhood where they might fall into a certain category. And I think there's enough gentrification in Chicago that the tier system is pretty imperfect around the edges. And so sort of a lot of underrepresented students who are high scoring but live in a higher tier are not getting in. And then you have overrepresented students who live in a lower tier who are getting in. And so those things kind of work against the diversity goals of the system, and not in a huge way, but they do identify some major improvements for moving to individual level data.
Good.
Thank you, Mr.
Perhaps we could have one more question.
I actually don't see any other hands raised. I was gonna, Ms. Tung.
Thank you for another chance. I know that Boston has chosen the NWEA's MAP assessment. It chose it before or during the pandemic, and it's the one that's been suspended. And so my question is just, do you know of any other districts that have used that for selective school admissions and the resulting diversity changes?
I don't offhand. I'm writing down these questions though, and if I can get an answer, I will.
Ms. Sullivan, I actually can't answer part of Ms. Tung's question.
Thank you.
Chicago actually uses the NWEA MAP assessment, as does Nashville and I believe Kansas City.
And Ms. Hogan, just following up on that, my understanding was that at least for BPS, that the district would be working with NWEA to really design an assessment that is aligned with the BPS curriculum. Is that correct, or am I incorrect with that?
So the RFP awarded the contract to NWEA for their MAP growth product. So it is not an assessment designed specifically for Boston, but the MAP growth is a computer adaptive test. And so it's a little different than your traditional standardized paper pencil, fill in the bubble test that you might be familiar with. Students have to answer a question to move on to the next question, and they cannot go back, because whether or not they got that question right determines what the next question they get is. And so if you get a question right, the next question will be slightly more challenging. If you get the question wrong, the next question will be slightly easier, to try and adapt to whatever level the student is at in that subject area. Did that answer your whole question?
It did. I want to make sure it absolutely responded to my question. I just want to make sure that I'm clear in terms of alignment with the BPS curriculum. So is the MAP assessment aligned with the BPS curriculum?
I believe so.
Okay. Well, we have another month together, so
we can definitely get you a confirmed question. Ms. Grass, I see you unmuted yourself. I don't know if you have a response.
I think obviously we should double check this. My understanding as a principal is that it is aligned to the standards that we teach. So not the curriculum per se.
Okay.
So it's not aligned to the curriculums, because you also could be using different curriculums in different schools. However, if you're a fifth grader, we are all required in the state of Massachusetts to teach the same state curriculum frameworks.
Okay.
Same state standards that Massachusetts produces. So it assesses on those standards. However, it adjusts based on where a student is at. So for example, I might take the test, I might get a bunch wrong, and it actually might scale me back to more 4th grade type questions as a 5th grader. Or I'm a 5th grader, I'm getting all the answers right. It might actually scale me up to more 8th grade type questions. That is my understanding of how the assessment works. So I do not think it does not align to our curriculum.
Okay, because we don't, within BPS, there is no consistent curriculum.
Correct, but the MAP assessment, so another district that uses it is Grand Rapids, Michigan. That's the same assessment they'll take in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in Kansas City, in Nashville, in Chicago. It's the same assessment. And it's a national rated ranking.
And I know a lot of districts use this assessment for formative purposes as well, because we also in Boston use it for formative assessment purposes that may not be using it for selective admissions purposes. So
super helpful. I think Ms. Roberts might have wanted to get in if she came on.
Yeah, good evening. I just wanted to confirm what Ms. Grasser was saying in terms of the alignment of the MAP. The reason why it was selected was for its alignment to the state curriculum standards, the state's framework, which is also what we align our curriculum to. So they're both mapped to the same standards. And so when we're assessing, we should be assessing the same things, despite the differences, as she stated, across the schools in terms of the curriculum being used.
Thank you. Ms. Tung, did that respond to your question, or did it create more questions? Or did it create more questions?
It did, but I'll follow up to find the answers.
Okay.
And share it with everyone.
Thank you. No, that is actually very helpful. And I actually went back. I know there was another question about other school districts using standardized tests or assessments. From what I understand as well, that most districts have either a standardized test, or for selective school admissions, use either a standardized test or some other form of assessment to establish. And I think this goes to the first bullet point in Dr. Cochran's presentation of academic fit, trying to assess whether a student is prepared for the intended curriculum. Mr. Contenpasis?
Yep, I think we need to move on. I just want to offer the thanks of the entire task force to Dr. Corcoran. Perhaps if you have the time, we may bring you back, depending on what we may find. Your slides, I understand, will be available to the task force. And I would suggest to the members that there is an extensive bibliography at the end, as Dr. Corcoran has presented. In looking at his paper on the New York public schools, I ran across something that I think the task force ought to be aware of. I know that Dr. Corcoran mentioned Melanie Rosinski and Joshua Goodman and their paper. In reading yours, and I must add, I was skimming it this afternoon, I ran across a brand new article that they've written, which is supposed to be in the MIT press sometime in the not too distant future, which is probably of interest to the task force and others. It's a 2021 paper entitled Racial Diversity and Measuring Merit, Evidence from Boston Exam School Admissions. Apparently, maybe some of you know this, but it was sanctioned by the Boston Public Schools. So I looked at it very quickly. I will make sure that Ms. Parvek puts it out for everybody to look at, but it's just another piece of homework that all of you probably will want to look at. But
A great study.
say again.
It's a great study. I highly recommend it.
Good, thank you, thank you. And once again, thanks for your effort. We're trying to move this along as we can. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we will have additional evidence of districts that have implemented different processes. But I do want to thank you, and we're going to move on, if we can, to public comment. And thank you once again.
Thanks so much.
Thank
right.
you, Dr. Corcoran.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
And Ms. Parvek, can you get us ready for public comment, if you would? And I just-
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Contampassis. We have 14 speakers this evening, and each speaker will have 2 minutes per person. I will let you know when you have 30 seconds left. Please state your name, affiliation, and what neighborhood you are from before you begin. When I call your name, please raise your hand virtually in Zoom. Also, please make sure you're signed into Zoom with the same name you used to sign up for public comment. That will allow us to identify you when it's your turn to testify. Our first speaker this evening is Sharon Hinton, followed by Lucia Colombaro and Somi Kim. So if you can raise your hand. Sharon Hinton.
Good evening. I'm Sharon Hinton, mother of a BPS graduate, educator, president of Black Teachers Matter Incorporated, and a Hyde Park homeowner. After observing today's court session regarding the exam school lawsuit, I'd like to submit my comments. In the interest of education equity, are there translation services available for those whose first language is not English, so the general public can understand what is being said and actually going on? Since the task force is doing such a good job, maybe that issue can be brought to the court's attention. Also, are there meetings scheduled by the task force to demystify the court proceedings and actual admissions formula and lawsuit for the general public whose children and households will be affected? I watched Judge Young take the time to fully understand what is being challenged, but I'm not sure the average parent has the time or wherewithal to understand what's going on or at stake. In addition to the Boston School Committee, Boston School Department websites, what other methods or media are being used to inform the public? I think I recall at the Boston School Committee meetings when the vote was taken to eliminate the exams requirement this year due to COVID, that many parents, especially white and Asian parents, expressed they felt confused and blindsided and not considered or included in the process or decision about the exam schools. I think more thought and effort to inform the general public may help to dispel information and promote transparency and community input during this process. And finally, even though students were introduced at the first task force meeting, it seemed as though the participants were heavily weighted with Boston Latin affiliates, including the most recent appointment to the Boston School Committee, a Boston Latin grad who's not part of the task force, but who I believe will have a conflict.
30 seconds left.
Thank you. As a school, I believe will have a conflict of interest as a school committee member moving forward. What's still missing in this process to me is student voice balance. And while this task force is trying very hard to use an equity lens during this process, I urge the task force to try and influence the court, Boston School Committee, and Boston School Department to utilize the open task force meetings and hearings to promote accessibility and transparency around this process and lawsuit. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lucia Colombaro. I don't see her. So if Lucia is here, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we will continue with Somi Kim. Somi?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Hey, my name is Somi Kim, and I'm a parent of a 10th grade BLA student and a 4th grade student at the Mildred Avenue K through 8 in Mattapan. We're in Mattapan. I'm here to express strong support for the zip code mandate because it's a step in the right direction to make the exam schools more fairly accessible to all of the children in Boston, not simply the wealthiest or the most resource-rich families. I find it appalling that the families in the lawsuit resisting the admissions reform are advocating that students from the wealthiest neighborhoods maintain their advantage over less privileged students. Many of these families have inherited the means and the privilege of sending their children to resource-rich elementary schools, whether private or public, already having an advantage over families in poor neighborhoods, and yet are attempting to block a policy that could support struggling families to have access to public resources in the form of the exam schools. Opponents of the zip code reform are claiming that it is somehow anti-Asian. As an Asian parent, I find this position fundamentally inaccurate and misguided. There are hundreds of Asian families in Dorchester alone who would benefit from the zip code mandate. My own Asian family in Mattapan would also benefit from this policy. I find that this lawsuit fighting the zip code mandate is in fact anti-poor and anti-working class, while the reform is an effort towards equity. A final point I would like to make as the daughter of poor working class Asian immigrants, I know there are plenty of families who share my position in support of the equity-based zip code mandate, but are not here because they are at work or they don't have the English language skills to feel confident to voice their positions or are simply afraid. This absence is only one example of how the poorest families are systemically left out of the conversation on how to create a more just school system for their own children. Do not let the absence of their voices be drowned out by the very loud voices of privileged parents. Asians deserve better representation. We deserve efforts to include us in the most equitable way possible. The zip code mandate is one way, and I want to thank the task force for all the work that they're doing. Thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker is Edith Bazil, followed by Dara Murphy and Sarah Safiris.
Hello, task force. My name is Edith Bazil. I am a mother of a Tech Boston graduate and grandmother of a BPS student at the Manning. If parents, students, educators, policymakers, researchers, and community members are interested in how anti-Black racism relates to exam schools and admissions practice, we should take a look at the past. Historically, one of the most effective movements against educating Black students was eugenics, a testing process that claimed white people were at the top hierarchy of intellectual superiority and people of African descent were at the bottom. These assessments were used to justify discrimination, claiming Black students were incapable of succeeding in academically rigorous programs. Eugenics was eventually discredited as junk science. Then came Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. 20 years later, Judge Garrity ordered Boston's desegregation, which removed only one barrier, but it did not resolve the issue of equitable access to exam schools, which remained overwhelmingly white. Black scholar and author, Professor Bell Hooks wrote, quote, "Bus to white schools, we soon learned that obedience and a zealous will to learn was expected of us. Too much eagerness to learn could easily be seen as a threat to white authority," end of quote. My point is, BPS must stop pretending Black students can't make it in exam schools and admit to the root cause.
You have 30 seconds
left. Anti-racism maintained and promoted since Boston Latin School was founded in 1635. 386 years of racism in exam schools is enough. Just because some Asian students benefit from the exam schools admissions does not change the fact that these policies are racist, discriminatory, and rooted in anti-Blackness. Black citizens should not pay taxes supporting a racist policy that harms their own children. Racism ruins lives in perpetuity. Finally, it is time for everyone to stand up for Black children who have waited far too long for racial equity. Racial equity means permanently ending the 386-year-old rigged anti-Black scoring system that maintains the status quo. And I thank this task force for your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Dara Murphy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Dara Murphy and I live in Dorchester 02122, a loser zip code under this policy. 02122 is not coincidentally mostly Asians who live in Fields Corner. Having grown up here, I remember when they began arriving in the 1980s as refugees from the Vietnam War. They were referred to in racist terms like boat people and other far worse names by many of my white neighbors at the time. They arrived with no English and were dirt poor. The 1980s were not that long ago. Asians in Fields Corner are still poor and working class. They still face language barriers and they still face racism. They are also your most loyal BPS families, attending BPS schools at rates far higher than other racial groups. Asian families are BPS families and BPS should care about them and treat them equally. According to BPS's own data, 105 Asian students from zip code 02122 have been invited to exam schools in the previous 3 years. That is too many Asians for your exam school task force, so you decided to use Asian birth rates against them as a way to exclude Asian kids from the exam schools. Asian families have fewer children than all other racial groups. By using the number of kids families have as the factor to allocate exam school seats, you are actually achieving your real goal, reducing the number of Asian children at BLS. Only 30% of Boston Public School students pass the MCAS every year. The inevitable result is that only 30% of BPS students qualify for exam schools every year. That's not because the test or the process is inequitable. It is because BPS is failing all its grade school students across the board, making it extremely unlikely that they can successfully complete a college prep high school curriculum. But rather than address the real problem at the root of the low numbers of Black students at BLS, this exam school task force wants to make Asian students the scapegoat, excluding them because, in your own words, there are too many of them. And now you're trying to convince the parents and people of Boston that that's what equity looks like. Your zip code quota policy is anti-Asian, and anti-Asian racism is racism, and it's wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Sarah Safiris, followed by Sarah Granfield and Domingos da Rosa. Sarah Safiris.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having us this evening. I just wanted to say a couple of things about the process. I am a BLS grad. I grew up in Dorchester. I live in West Roxbury now. There's been a lot said about opponents of the zip code policy, of which I am one, and I think there's been some misconceptions about that. Firstly, that if you're against this policy, that you're against equity. I don't think that's the case. I talked to a lot of parents who agree that there's an issue if that there aren't enough students of color at Boston Latin School, but they just don't think the zip code policy is the right way to go. So I think you can, be in favor of equitable solutions, but not agree with this particular one. A couple other things that get said a lot about opponents. People talk on the committee and the school committee in particular about tutoring. I was not tutored for the test. I didn't tutor my 9th grader who goes there now. My 6th grader was not tutored either. It is a lot of parents do that, but not everyone does it. So I think that's something to think about in terms of who the people are who are not in favor of this policy. Last year, the superintendent chose the new MAP test, which was just discussed with Dr. Corcoran. I'm in favor. That was a great move. The ICE was not a great fit. It should have been dropped a long time ago. I thought that was a big plus that she had chosen that test, and we should move forward with it. BPS also, the year before, had administered the test in school. That was another great step toward equity. It eliminated the barriers of transportation and sign up and cost that the ISCE had put on families. They did that for 1 year and then they dropped that too. And again, that was the old test. I think administering the new MAP test in schools in BPS would have an important effect, as would BPS exam school initiative. All those things were in play and they all got abandoned for this new zip code plan, which the speaker mentioned did blindside parents. There was no public input, no public comment. And now you have a lawsuit that's, causing this huge delay. And now people in 6th grade still have no idea where the child's going to school. So I think the current plan has caused a lot of disruption and heartache and isn't a good one. And I hope the exam school committee will not move forward with more of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Sarah Granfield, followed by Domingos da Rosa and Joy McDonald. Sarah Granfield.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Sarah Granfield. I am a BPS graduate and a lifelong resident of the city of Boston. I very much support the goals of diversity within and equitable access to the exam schools. However, the zip code quota is a poorly devised plan that will only exacerbate inequities related to wealth within neighborhoods. If the premise of the proposed zip code quota plan is true, that wealth is a highly determinative factor in exam school admissions, then it must follow that even with no exam, children and families of greater economic means will continue to have advantages that maximize their chance of admission to exam schools. That is the very premise of the policy, and if true, the result will be that low-income students in many neighborhoods will face drastically reduced odds at exam school admission. The injustice of the zip code quota will obviously be most evident in neighborhoods like Charlestown, which has significant economic diversity, but will see a large reduction in seats. But the impact will be felt by low-income students in all neighborhoods in which there will be a manufactured reduction in seats. The fact is, no one, not even its supporters, believes that the working group's primary goal is to increase economic or geographic diversity, just as no one who was paying attention believed that this was ever intended to be a one-year plan, despite what the public was told. By backing into a methodology that the working group hopes will withstand legal scrutiny, they have created a Pandora's box, one of the many harms of which will be visited upon low-income students in zip codes that will lose seats. In response to the presentation tonight, I would like to point out that there is an enormous difference in dividing an applicant pool by the 5 boroughs of New York City, a city of 8 million people, or the 4 economic tiers.
30 seconds left.
Or the 4 economic tiers in Chicago, a city of nearly 3 million people, than by the 30 zip codes of Boston, a city of less than 700,000 people. I urge the working group and the school committee to focus on paths to equity that are not intentionally discriminatory to students based on where they live and how much their neighbors earn. I'd also like to close by asking, where is the working group tasked with creating enough good high schools to meet the demand of all the students who are both capable and desirous of an exam school caliber education?
Thank you. Next speaker is Domingo Starrosa.
Good evening, folks. How you guys doing tonight? Hope all is well. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me. Okay, thumbs up. I love it. I love it. The thumbs are working. Everyone's thumbs are working. I just wanted to add, I'm a Bostonian. I'm going to start off by a tax-paying Bostonian. I'm a parent. I'm a BPS alumni, class of 96 at Madison Park. As I sit here and listen to all this great data and try to figure out how it best fits the city of Boston. As you know, our school system is way smaller than New York's and Chicago's. So for me, the numbers are kind of off when we compare the two cities with Boston. But anyway, what I like to say tonight is, you know, as a former student of BPS, when I was in middle school, a lot of the opportunities that was presented to myself and classmates didn't include the exam schools. We wasn't prepared for it. One of the questions tonight that was asked is, what are we doing to feed the pipeline? So my biggest concern is, how can we increase that flow in the pipeline if we still have issues in our lower ends of the school system, there from the elementary level into middle school? If there's something that we can do collectively to address how we do feed the pipeline, then it can kind of address how we go about actually allowing others to enter into the exam school process. I'm in favor for a hybrid system, their abilities, along with some of the extra activities that they do during and after school. Some
30 seconds left.
Character they do in a lot of the private schools. My son graduated in 2017 from BC High. He wasn't, I guess, smart enough to get into Latin, but he was smart enough to get into BC High. Was doing as a student actually made one of the top-notch educations in the state. So I would like to see, you know, this body include more input from the parents, more input from the students, and figure out a way that a system that would work for Boston. I'm very excited to hear about what's going on in New York. But again, New York is a city that's 3 times the size of Boston, same with Chicago. So if we can find, you know, professionals within our own city to come up with a plan that would fit our city, that would be a plus for the city. So I thank you for your time. I look forward to learning more. and being involved in the conversation as we move forward and making our exam schools accessible to all Bostonians across the city.
Thank you. Next speaker is Joy McDonald. Joy?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. I'm speaking tonight against the zip code quota policy for the admissions to the exam schools. I'm opposed to using racial quotas based on zip codes. My son 2 years ago got into BLS from a BPS school, and we chose not to send him there because we didn't think it would be the right fit for his learning style. He's a smart kid, but not up for the academic rigor. My 6th grade daughter, another BPS student, on the other hand, has been working hard for years towards her academic goals to get into one of the exam schools. She's a hard worker, self-motivated, gifted student, and should not be discriminated against based on her zip code or her race. We need to fix the pipeline to these exam schools. We need to fix our failing elementary schools and give students the education they need to succeed, especially those who are underprivileged. We cannot tear the system down from the top. We need to fix the problems and build up from the elementary level. We need to fix the failing elementary schools and also the non-exam high schools. We need more good high schools in Boston, not exam schools, just regular good high schools for kids like my son. But we cannot discriminate against students based on their zip code or race to hide the districts failing to prepare underprivileged students at an elementary level. Another issue I have with this policy change is students in the pool had until January 29th to rank their school choices. I quote from a BPS email sent to the pool applicants on January 7th. The completed school choice forms must be returned by Friday, January 29th, 2021 for your school ranks to be considered as part of the invitation process. If you do not submit your school rankings, students will not be considered for admissions to BPS exam schools.
You have
If
30
this was the
seconds left.
If this was the case, why was the district calling families who didn't rank almost a month after the deadline, February 27th, to try to get them to rank school choices? Shouldn't any outreach have been done before the deadline, not a month after? Maybe the numbers weren't looking how they wanted. It almost seems like the district is trying to engineer the exam school spots. This kind of behavior by the district saying one thing and doing another makes parents further distrust the district. Students deserve a transparent, unbiased admissions policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Nancy Minucci, followed by Jess Madden Fuoco.
Hi, this is Nancy Minucci. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Hi. I am a BPS graduate. I started out Trotter, ended up going to Boston Latin School. My husband, on the other hand, did not get into Boston Latin School, and he did go to English High, which at the time was not the top school, but that is where he ranked and that's where he attended. I felt like what you're doing now, at the last minute, juggling parents all over the place. No one knows what is going on. We don't know when we're going to find out. We are so aggravated, frustrated, and mistrusting of BPS. BPS has not served the whole population very well. When only 6 elementary schools are passing, had more than 50% of the students passing the MCAS, well, shame on BPS. That is very outrageous, and people should be upset. But you cannot hurt the children who managed through that to do well. And it's not just in rich areas, because 2 areas are being, the numbers are going down for the Elliott and the Warren Prescott. Their allotment of spots is going down highly, but yet other schools that did very well, like the Bradley in East Boston, their numbers are going up. So it's not, and the Hale did very well. So it's not just one area of the city that's doing well. There are certain schools.
You have 30 seconds left.
But you're only taking away certain areas that did very well are getting tiny allotments of seats. It doesn't make any sense. I understand that you want diversity, but taking away things because BPS as a whole has failed children is not the way to go. It's making people want to leave BPS, want to leave the city. You're selling kids out. You're selling the kids short from day one. six elementary schools passing 50% is unbelievable. It's embarrassing. BPS should be embarrassed. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Jess Madden-Foucault.
Hi, my name's Jess Madden-Foucault. Thank you so much for all of your amazing work. I'm really so grateful to your task force. I have worked in BPS since 2002 and have had children in the Boston Public Schools since 2011, when my older daughter began in K1 at the Hernandez. I now have two daughters at the Hernandez, one in 8th grade, one in 1st grade. We live in Hyde Park and I identify as white. We did not apply for admissions to exam schools for my daughter when she was in 6th grade or now when she is in 8th grade, because the past admission systems has a racist impact and we don't want to participate in a racist system. I want you to know that there are many families who support your work to make the exam school process more equitable and less racist. Families and educators have watched for years as the exam schools make middle schoolers who don't get in feel like they are less than those who do, not as smart, not as good students, left behind. I know that you all don't believe these students are less than those who gain admission to an exam school, but when we use an exam to determine admissions to a school, we are saying that an exam measures something important for admission. Does it measure intelligence? We know it doesn't. And all of you who have taught or led at non-exam schools know how brilliant students are at all of our schools. Does it measure potential? We know it doesn't. Unfortunately, what we do know is that those who do better on standardized tests usually have privilege. They may have attended stronger schools, or they may have a parent who's paid for a tutor or a test prep class. I'm hoping that your working group will eliminate the exam requirement permanently.
You have 30 seconds left.
I'm not sure how many of you have been part of administering the MAP assessment, but there are often major technical glitches and issues with administration. So I'm hoping we can ensure that we are informed about the quality of this specific assessment too, before getting too excited about it. As Dr. Ibram Kendi said when Tanisha Sullivan shared his remarks with the school committee this fall, what is always best for the community is admissions policies that create equal opportunity for all. I'm so grateful to all of you for your work, and please let me know how I can support.
Thank you. Next speaker is Elaine Conroy, followed by Lauren Trimble and Fong Wen. Elaine?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elaine Conroy. I'm a 60-year resident of the city of Boston. I'm a parent of an exam school grad. I have another child who went through private school. My husband and I work very hard. I feel like when I listen to people talk about privileged parents, they don't understand the work that we put in to give our kids what we feel they need. As far as BPS goes, I feel like they're trying to blow up the exam schools when they really need to focus on making the lower schools much better for every child. I've seen it in action that they're not focusing on the basics of literacy, and they really need to work from the bottom up. And they also do need to create high schools for everybody. And the exam school zip code policy is discriminatory against many people. It's not giving equal opportunity to anybody. Thank you to the task force for all your hard work. And I'm sure that there are better policies that could be explored. But also, I feel like you're not doing right by the parents by making them wait on the admissions to the exam schools and also not clear on the policies. Thank you. I'm through, and thank you for your thank you for listening.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lauren Trimble. Please unmute yourself. Oh, okay. I think she left. Fong Wen. Fong Wen.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Hello, hi everyone. My name is Phương Nguyen. I am from Dorchester, a parent of a BOS student and a sixth grader at the Murphy School. First of all, I appreciate that BPS is doing something to address the inequity at the exam school. However, I agree with the zip code quota and the income assignment. What BPS is doing, basically just taking opportunity from one group of children and give it to another group. How is that fair to others, like other students who should be eligible? I think that there's a better way to do it. If you are taking the lottery, then it should be applied citywide lottery based on the GPA and put it in a pool. That is one way to go, rather than go by the zip code. Why I can't speak for all of the Asian community. However, I feel that we are being targeted because our students just perform a little bit higher academically than other student group. But because they are hardworking to get there. I think BPS should focus on the enhancing the curriculum for the lower grade, from grade 3 to 5, and in order to prepare them for the exam school, they should expand in the AWQC program for all of the school. Also, they should make improve other high school and create more seats for the eligible students. Lastly, I think my last point that this meeting should be made available to all the parents and should be advertised so all parents would have the knowledge and opportunity to attend. Because I don't think every parent or all the parents, even though that I know that don't know this meeting exists, so that it should be made available to all or advertised to all parents. And thank you, the task force, for all your hard work. I think you have a very, very big job to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan and Mr. Contompasses. That concludes our speakers for public comment.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Parvex, and to all of our fellow Bostonians who shared with us this evening. We are, before we close out the meeting, as always, want to give task force members an opportunity to react or respond to anything that we've talked about today. I'll hold my comments until the end. Does anyone would anyone like to share? Yes, Mr.
Ms. Sullivan, yes, I know that in the school committee meetings, there is an opportunity for those who are sharing public comment to submit written, just written summaries of their comments or the comments in writing. I would love to encourage that. There are some of these comments that I'd love to, I want people to know you've been heard. And I'd love to, even if just to incorporate everyone's comments in our own consciousness and in thinking, that we solicit these comments in writing if they're at all available. And I don't know if Ms. Parvex is already doing that or if we already have a system for that.
Yep. Public comment is always welcome, either orally and or in writing. And Ms. Parvex is receiving those and will be sharing them out as they come in. Any other comments or questions or thoughts before we close out? Yes, Ms. Garrett. Was that a hand? That was like a partial. That was like a maybe.
Because I was still thinking about this, just thinking about different speakers today talking about the one-year policy that was recommended at this point and our work to think about something more permanent. I would just ask us to consider at some point in our dialogue the challenges of our now being in a second year of a time where we actually may not have the things available to us that some of the things that Dr. Corcoran mentioned because of the continued challenges around the pandemic this year. And I just imagine that might be something that we need to navigate around as we think about what is best for the students in Boston long-term and what limitations we may frankly have again. And I hate to even say that out. I was prompted to just kind of put that out there, thinking about our task and just how long this has stretched with students' educational experiences being so varied and disrupted.
No, thank you. Ms. Tung.
Thank you. I was wondering if the task force members could receive the PDFs of the Ellison and Patak and Rusinski and Goodman papers that he referenced. Because some of us don't have access to grabbing them from, academic websites. Those seem to be the two most relevant.
Could you repeat those? Which two, Ms. Tung?
Sure. The 2021, the two authors are Ellison and Patak.
Yep.
And then the Rusinski and Goodman, which I think has been published in the last year.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to ask Ms. Roberts if you could help us in trying to secure those. That would be fantastic.
Will do.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Lum.
I'm not a statistician, but I am curious to know if some of the comments mentioned today regarding Chicago, New York, as well as some of the studies research presented that indicated that the test taking discrepancies in those cities weren't as big as the test discrepancies here in Boston. I want to know how those factors would potentially be considered as we are moving forward in our work.
It's good. Great. Any others? Mr. Condompasis, did you have anything? No, you're all set. I can look, you're on mute and I could read your lips on that one. Okay. Well, I want to just remind us that we will, over the next few weeks, Mr. Condompasis said this at the beginning, we're really going to try to have speakers come in, experts from other parts of the country come in to help us better understand, what's happening in other parts of the country as it relates to admissions processes. And then also, to the extent we are interested, perhaps some of the researchers, some of the scholars who've done work in this space. So we'll be doing that together. This will be a learning journey for all of us over the next few weeks before we actually, start to put pen to paper to think about both criteria and mechanism for a proposed policy. So we've got plenty of time together. Plenty of time to get answers to questions and to respond to requests as they may arise. I am, after listening to, participating in our listening session on Saturday, which was fantastic, listening today as well. I am very concerned about the information, incorrect information that may be swirling through our community relative to the current status of the exam school policy. And what that says to me is that this is not our responsibility as a task force, but it says to me that, I think BPS needs to do a better job at communicating to our community writ large what the temporary policy is and what it is not. Because having accurate information will help to hold us together as a community, and allowing for incorrect information, fake news as they used to call it, can only serve to divide us as a community. And so I really want to, encourage the district to spend more time helping to educate our community as a whole on what the process, the temporary process is and what it is not. I also want to, and I shared this on Saturday, I'm going to say it again. I'm very encouraged by what is possible through this process for us as a whole community, as a city, as stakeholders in the BPS. I'm very optimistic about what's possible through this process, and I'm encouraged by what I've heard and what I've seen for the most part. That said, I remain very mindful at how divisive this process can be if we allow it to be. And it will be, as a co-chair of this task force, it will be my goal to help ensure that we do not allow the divisiveness to take root or to take hold, and that we do not allow for the pitting of one racial group against other racial groups. That cannot be what we accept in our community, in our beloved city. And that cannot be what this process is used to advance. And so I do hope that, again, through education, because there's I heard a lot of misinformation, through education, we will be able to help our community as a whole understand, what we're charged to do as a task force, and what we hope to accomplish as a task force. And that is, to present a recommendation on a policy to our school committee that really speaks to where we are as a city in 2021. Mr. Condon passes.
You're both on mute.
We're both on mute. Mr. Condon passes.
Okay.
There we
Can you
go.
hear
Yes, sir.
And this is a question that Pastor Acevedo sent me in the chat. I'm disturbed by the fact that, as you have suggested, there might be confusion around what's really in the recommendations. That's number one. Number two, whatever we come up with. I think it is essential that, and I don't know yet how to do this, that the community is well aware of the recommendations that we're going to make to the committee before they're actually made. And that may, given the situation that we're all dealing with, it's going to be very difficult to do without there being, without this ongoing public comment period. I think it's essential that whatever the plan is, that people are aware of what our thinking is before it goes to the committee.
Yeah, I mean, I think by virtue of, open meeting, law, anything, any of our discussions or deliberations relative to the process will happen in this forum, in the virtual forum for the foreseeable future. And so, as we move through this process, our fellow Bostonians will be moving with us. Now, certainly from, when it comes from an input standpoint, it is through the public comment and also through the listening session. So we had 2 listening sessions already. The next listening session will be sometime in May, that the public has an opportunity to weigh in. And on Saturday, we heard some really, I thought, interesting recommendations as it relates to what, a potential policy could look like. And so, one, yes, by virtue of this process, because this is a task force and all of our meetings are open, the public will be moving through this with us, including as we start to put pen to paper. 2, I encourage folks to start using public comments, the public comment period, to make recommendations on policy. This is the opportunity, if you want to have your say in what a policy could look like, this is the opportunity for the public to weigh in and make those recommendations, that we as a task force will then surely take into consideration. And to Mr. Acevedo's point, to the extent that individuals want to send policy recommendations in writing, send them in. Now is the time to do that, certainly throughout this process. I do hope, and again, I want to double click on this, I do hope that we start to use public comment for that purpose. Policy recommendations, constructive policy recommendations to help inform the work of this group.
Yeah, and I think that's where I'm coming from. We need to make that switch.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
From everyone telling us what's right or wrong with the interim process and begin to think about what are really folks thinking about out there that possibly go beyond the status quo.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They know what the charge is. Maybe we have to remind them regularly what it is. Maybe we have to remind them at the beginning of every meeting that we're looking for new ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So that we don't spend as much time hearing that the zip code is not a perfect system.
Mm-hmm.
Because quite honestly, and I don't mean this in any critical way, no system is going to be perfect. But, and then the other thing that came up that I quite don't know how to deal with.
Okay.
And that was our first speaker, who talked about not knowing, which direction the court's going in and what have you. I, for one, would feel uncomfortable telling Judge Young that he's got to be more transparent, or whatever the term would be. But the speaker raises a point. You know, some of us are able to tune in to the court hearing, others are not. So I don't know quite how to handle that. You know, we're not in a position as a task force to give an update of what's happening in the federal court.
And that is not our role.
It's not our role. And so I just want to make that clear, that we understand where it's coming from. But this would be literally no different than any case appearing in federal district court. And how the district or the school committee, or for that matter, the task force, you know, gets into that is, I think, beyond our scope. And with that, it's time, I think, to.
Yeah, I do want to comment on that as well. And Mr. Acevedo, I see your hand. I'll come to you in one moment. Just want to stay with this comment. I'm glad that you called that out. I actually had it in my note to call it out as well, and I missed it. Sorry about that. Right. The charge of this body is specifically related to the admissions policy. It is, we are not, as a task force, in a position to, nor will we, get into the details of any pending case. To the, you know, that is, you know, really within the purview of other entities, other bodies. But that being said, I will always encourage us as residents, as Bostonians, to, you know, to try to sit in on those hearings, because they are quite interesting. And to the extent that you are connected to other organizations, encourage them to host, you know, kind of informational sessions relative to them. But that is not the scope of this body. And we do have a charge, and we've got a deadline to meet. And Mr. Kondopassis and I assure you, we will meet that deadline in terms of delivering a policy. But that means that we've got to start pivoting and getting to the business of designing a policy. Mr. Acevedo.
Ms. Sullivan, Mr. Kondopassis, just one quick suggestion to the point brought up by each of you. You know, disinformation has a funny way of being strengthened the more we deny it. That's the nature of conspiracy theories.
Indeed.
But, and several have already been swelling around us and this work since the working group. But would it be possible to create some sort of facts versus myths document about what is and what is not the nature of our work, the nature of our recommendations? I mean, sometimes it takes a bit more creativity than it seems to create. But first, you have to identify the myths. And Ms. Sullivan, you seem to have a real, your finger on the pulse of what some of these myths are. And we may actually garner many of these myths through the comments, which is good. We want them to, we want it out. We want it out. I think over time, and then we'll just be able to point to Mythbuster item number 3 or whatever. Yeah, we've seen that before. We've already addressed that. Have you, but to be able to create a document that addresses, that separates fact from myth, particularly as we zero in on an actual policy, it's a non-permanent policy, and continue these listening sessions with the community.
Yeah, I agree. We need to give that some thought. Again, you know, I definitely want us to stay on focus, but it is important to acknowledge that, you know, that there's the myths and the false information is creeping. It's not is creeping. It absolutely has entered into our conversation. And so we are going to have to address it, because again, it will only serve to keep us from achieving, you know, our charge, which is to present a policy. And it's also just not healthy for us as Bostonians. It's not healthy. It's divisive. And, you know, and so many of us work really hard every day to bring us together as a community, that we've got to make sure that, that again, that we're doing what we can to put the correct information out there. And what better, quite frankly, what better body than us, those of us who actually wrote the darn thing, to help people to better understand it. So, so we'll take care of that. All right. So this was great conversation. I want to thank again all of our fellow Bostonians who contributed to the conversation. Want to thank Dr. Corcoran for being our first outside speaker. I absolutely want to thank our dynamic interpreter team for being with us and for making sure that this meeting was accessible. And I will now entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. I got Mr. Contemposis, and I think Mr. Acevedo got in there a little before you, Ms. Grassa, on the second. Ms. Parvex, could you
Yes.
call the roll, please?
Thank you. Mr. Acevedo,
Yay.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom. Did she leave? Okay. Ms. Grassa,
Yes.
Ms. Lam,
Yes.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Yes.
Ms. Garrett,
Yes.
Ms. Tang,
Yes.
Ms. Waite,
Yes.
Ms. Sullivan,
Yes.
Mr. Condompasis.
Yes.
It's unanimous.
Thank you so very much. Good night, everyone.